Well, let's continue to get reaction now. Media coverage has been a focal point of the conflict, with Israel banning Al Jazeera earlier in the war, raising concerns over press freedom and access to information. The world now watches closely to see if the ceasefire can in fact hold. To speak more on this, let's now welcome William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa. William, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So the Enclave's Health Ministry reports that over 80 people, Palestinians, have been killed in the past 24 hours after Israeli military stepped up attacks in the Gaza Strip. Now, one of those killed moments before a ceasefire deal, in fact, was announced was Palestinian journalist Ahmed Abu al-Ros, bringing to at least 206 or so the number of Palestinian journalists killed during this 15-month period. What have you viewed about the state of the press freedom in the region, specifically over the past couple of months during this conflict, given just the alarming rate of journalists that have been killed?
Good afternoon. Well, I think it broadly shows that most governments pay lip service to journalists losing their lives in either conflict or generally. Outside of that, we know that when journalists lose their lives in the course of their work, it isn't just the journalists and their families and loved ones that suffer the consequences. It means there's suddenly one less person to bring accurate, credible information to us as the members of the public who are several thousand miles away from that particular conflict scenario, right? We rely as members of the public on our journalists to bring us stories that have been verified, that are credible, and that are accurate, to help us understand what's actually going on from all different perspectives. Now, what we've seen with this conflict is not only have there been, I think, a record number of journalists killed in this particular conflict, we've also just seen the explosion of mis and disinformation surrounding it, right? The competing narratives that every time, and some of them official, some of them unofficial sources, every time there's an event, you'll see different views and ideas, and in fact, completely different versions as to why and what happened. And this really does highlight the critical importance of why you need credible news media, credible public broadcasters, particularly, to tell us what's actually going on. Because otherwise, you were not going to have an idea.
Absolutely. And when we look at this particular conflict, how does the blocking of certain media like Al Jazeera and other foreign correspondents, in fact, from reporting impact global understanding of this particular conflict, especially, the narrow narrative that is being pushed by some, raising questions again about transparency and accountability on the ground?
It's really interesting because this is a conflict, unlike ones that are occurring on our own continent, that has really captured the global attention. It knocked the war in Ukraine off the international headlines. That had been the one that had dominating headlines. That took very much a back seat to this particular conflict. So global media houses have tended to, and by that I, in most instances, tend to mean ones from developed nations, have dominated those kinds of agendas. So there's a couple of things there. The one is we saw very serious allegations about the BBC and about the approach that they took to this, which would suggest that their views and their ability to report as honest brokers and as honest journalists were in fact compromised, not by their editorial policies, but by the kind of broader foreign government policies of the UK, and that's a significant worry. When you see a country banning, news media organizations, you know that that's an effort because they know that they're going to say things or report things that they don't like. That's not uncommon to this conflict or indeed to conflicts throughout the world. We see governments around the world doing this on a routine basis, where any news entity that isn't favorable to them, they either ban them or they seek to shut them down. So that's a traditional kind of method of, if you like, of conflict. But it's also exactly why we need to highlight the critical need for diverse views. You should be able to have entities that are there that favor, for example, the Israelis, and those that favor the Palestinians, those that do something between, so that as members of the public, our take on it can be well informed by a range of different views. When you go and limit that you then tend to make sure that the narratives that are coming out are going to be less diverse.
Yeah, when we look at, the reaction by the South African government on the ceasefire deal through, of course, the Department of International Relations, saying that the successive ruling of the ICJ, the provisional measures, prescribed by the ICJ must be adhered to by the occupying power. Do you think then we will see a time where international protocols, the safety and protection for media professionals, as an example, just being adequately enforced, especially in this region?
I mean, I'd like to say yes, but unfortunately, moves that we're seeing globally don't encourage that kind of view. It's not a reason for us to give up. As we saw with South Africa's bold approach to this, it required a nation, a developing nation, to go and say, actually, we're going to do something that others haven't done, and we're going to take Israel to the ICC. Now, whether or not the ruling comes out that favors or disfavors South Africa, this is fundamentally such an important act in terms of putting our faith in the international system, in the international legal system. And that's something that says we are genuinely committed to these principles of democracy and of human rights, because let the court decide. Now, when you take that as an approach, it says you want to then hope that other nations are going to follow suit in terms of saying, yes, we're actually going to take steps to protect journalists. Unfortunately, the moves by the USA, the election of President Donald Trump, the support that he's receiving from characters like Elon Musk, who have a very clear agenda and very negative disposition towards journalistic news entities, means that we're unlikely to see any kind of significant protection of our journalists for the next few years. But then again, just because some of the countries aren't going to respect it is no reason for us not to fight tooth and nail and keep continually highlighting the critical role that journalists play, and to fight to make sure that those that do take their lives are held accountable.
I mean, as we speak, there's concern that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is holding back this cabinet vote that will essentially see the ceasefire deal, and a lot of people are concerned about that. But another concern, of course, is that, and this is coming from, international analysts that we've interviewed, is that the concern is that the ceasefire might end the killing, but it will not end the long-standing conflict. And as we look at this broader implications then for journalism, how might the attacks, do you think, and the killing of media impact coverage of future conflicts, do you think?
Well, I think what we're seeing globally is a decline in the number of people who are journalists, because a lot of the news organizations simply can't employ that number. So the number of people that we're relying on is probably going to decline even further. The less journalists on the ground, the less stories you can get, the less perspectives, the less views, and the less sort of more comprehensive idea of what's actually going on. So it's never a good thing when journalists are killed, and certainly when they're prevented from doing their basic job. I think the thing that this does highlight, though, is, of course, we tend as media to come and report on things by the time the crisis is at its head, by the time it's at its worst moments, right? We aren't, or very seldom are we reporting on things that lead up to that particular sense of crisis, so that the public see this thing as happening often out of context, particularly if we think about conflicts on our continent. But then they also, as you correctly point out, if and when there's a ceasefire, many journalists then tend to go and move on to the next conflict, because those are the things that are far more newsworthy on some level. And the real hard work of building that country up again, building relations, building trust, all of those sorts of things that have to happen when there is a ceasefire, often we see a lot less of that. And of course we can understand why, because it's not nearly as newsworthy on some level as seeing bombs falling on buildings as it is seeing diggers moving in and trying to clear rubble and start rebuilding things.
Yeah, and I think, William, therein lies the problem of course, that conversation in terms of taking that story forward and talking meaningfully about issues before they become a crisis is certainly an important point. William Bird, thank you so much for your time, Director of Media Monitoring Africa there for us. Of course, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now accusing Hamas of backtracking on some of the details in this ceasefire, and Hamas is denying this. Of course, we're monitoring those developments very closely for you and what this means in terms of delaying that January 19 ceasefire deal to start. All right.